All right, everyone, let's get started. Welcome to the insect status of insect webinar series. So I'm Christy Bala. I'm one of the co-PIs in the network. And today it is my pleasure to introduce Kayla Perry. Kayla is an assistant professor of forest entomology at Ohio State University. She is also, as I said in the email, my very favorite coleopterist. She is an expert, particularly on the carabids, especially associated with forest systems. But she has been an instrumental member from very early on in the development of the RCN, in her leadership in the trait working group. So she has been working with a team of people actually to build a very large database of insect traits that enable us to look at large scale responses and more trait-based approaches to disturbance. So anyway, today she's going to be telling us about the developments of this database and all the things that they're learning. So without further ado, take her away, Kayla.
Awesome. Thanks, Christy, for that awesome introduction. So today I am here to provide an update on what the Trait Database Working Group has been up to, what we're currently working on, how you can get involved if you're interested, and I guess like why traits. So first I want to acknowledge, I can change the slide. Maybe. Oops, too far. I want to acknowledge all of my collaborators and co-authors here within the working group. Without these folks, we wouldn't be where we are in terms of our progress. And we formed this working group in February 2023, and since then have been working diligently on this lofty goal of a trait database. So thank you to all of these folks. If you're here at the end of this presentation, I'd love for you to unmute and join in on the discussion as well. Okay. So I said we formed in 2023, and we had this lofty goal of collating and harmonizing existing trait data into this unified database. And our focus has been on terrestrial and freshwater insects specifically. So we don't necessarily have like an overarching research question, but the goal is to build this resource that researchers can then use to answer specific questions related to insect decline, changing environmental conditions, etc. And so within this lofty goal, we identified some objectives early on. And so we wanted to model this database on the plant trait database TRI, because this has been a really great success for plant ecologists. And so we were using this as our model in identifying this goal and these objectives. And so we wanted to first assess existing trait data that exists currently and identify any gaps within those existing databases or data sets, like what's missing in terms of trait data if we want to use this to understand insect decline. We wanted to develop a standard ontology for insect traits. So basically, types of traits, definitions of traits, a standardized way to collect and collate data. We've also considered building tools for extraction of trait data from existing databases in the literature. So how do we get trait data that exists in these dispersed areas into one location? And then also creating an online interface for future use and contribution of trait data. And so this is where we started when this working group formed. And so I want to talk a little bit now about like why focus on traits, like what's the importance of using traits to understand insect decline. And then I want to go through and provide some updates about what we've done with this list of objectives, what we're currently doing, and include some ways for folks to get involved if they're interested. So, why traits? And so traits are essentially species level characteristics. They could be morphological, physiological, phenological, or behavioral. They're these characters that are measurable on individuals or on species and populations. So it can be things like body size, it can be things like habitat preferences, but There are traits that exist from the cell all the way up to the full organism. And what makes these traits functional is that they are thought to impact fitness. So either directly or indirectly affect an individual's growth, reproduction, or survival. And so ideally, these traits should be heritable. And so they are related to performance of individuals and how those performances are linked to environmental conditions or ecosystem properties. And so essentially these characters that we're calling traits of different organisms influence their fitness via interactions with the abiotic and biotic environment and their roles within a system, the ecosystems that they live. And so traditional approaches to understanding communities have largely focused on like taxonomic characters. So looking at species abundance, richness, and diversity. And although understanding taxonomic metrics are very important, like it's important to know what species you have in your sample or at your site, there are limitations to taxonomic approaches. And these context dependencies can limit our ability to understand species and community responses at larger spatial and temporal scales. And so we can use trait-based approaches to generalize patterns that are beyond taxa and across different locations. And so trait-based approaches can allow various comparisons between studies, ecosystems, and biomes. And they also provide a link to understanding ecosystem processes. So these trait-based approaches can aid various syntheses when you're looking at diverse taxonomic communities that perhaps don't have the same species within them. They can help give insights into why organisms are responding to environmental change, why they may be declining or not declining, and then provide this mechanistic basis for predicting as well as understanding changes in ecosystem function. So a lot of reasons why applying a trait-based approach is really complementary to various taxonomic approaches when trying to understand insect communities. Now, when applying a trait-based approach to your research, it's important to understand that there are a variety of different types of traits. There's also some variability in terms of definitions of traits. And so it's important to select traits that are relevant to your study question. And so while trait-based approaches can improve this mechanistic understanding of ecological systems, the research really does require a clear definition and categorization of traits, proper trait selection, and that of course relates to the trait data that are available. So I want to talk about some different types of traits and how they relate to that definition of impacting fitness. So first we have performance traits. And so these are direct measures of fitness via growth, reproduction, or survival. And so these can be measures of biomass, reproductive output, or longevity, but they're directly related or indirectly related. So they're very closely measuring an individual's fitness or performance. Now, there are other types of traits that are perhaps more indirect. And so these are considered response or effect traits. And so response traits, which are also considered ecological or Grinnellian traits, these reflect responses to interspecific interactions or changes in environmental conditions. So they help determine an individual's response to changes in the environment or interactions with other organisms, therefore affecting their preference. And so these can be things like desiccation resistance or thermal tolerance. There's also effect traits. And so these are often referred to as biological traits or Eltonian traits, and they reflect effects on trophic interactions and adaptations to environmental conditions and impacts of those on ecological processes. And so these can be things like consumption rate or resource use. And so we have these response and effect traits and performance traits that folks typically measure to understand fitness either directly or indirectly. And then we also have what are called functional trait proxies. And so these are typically correlated with other types of traits, so correlated with response, effect, or performance traits, but they're usually easier to measure, and so they're more commonly measured. And a great example of a functional proxy trait is body size. And so body size can be correlated to things like consumption rate. It can also be correlated to reproductive output or biomass. And so all these types of traits are found in the literature, and they are measured on various insect groups. And as a working group, we're interested in all these types of traits for terrestrial and freshwater insects, but different types of traits are more or less appropriate for different types of research questions. And so response traits are relevant when research questions are seeking to identify how a species or population might be coping with various environmental stressors, while effect traits are examined when research questions focus on how individuals or populations might interact and impact its environment. And so there's still ongoing debate and discussion about which traits are most useful, which traits should be measured, what traits are best used to answer different types of ecological questions. But within these different categories, we have this increasing causal relationship with fitness of an individual. And so selecting traits for use is a very important first step when using functional trait-based approaches in research. So I mentioned that the plant ecologists, like the plant community, has developed this plant trait database, TRI, and that has really fueled research in plant traits within ecology. And it's taken a while for insects and arthropod researchers to catch up, but there has been this push to use a functional trait framework to understand insect community responses as well as other arthropod groups. And there's been work on identifying traits for different taxa to do this. And so here's just some examples. So for terrestrial and freshwater insects, there are several databases that have been created. So we have, as an example here, LEP traits, which includes butterflies and moths. We have global ants, which is an ant trait database. We have freshwater ecology.info, which includes freshwater macroinvertebrate traits. We also have literature looking at standardized trait measurements and different functional trait frameworks for other groups, including beetles. However, most of these insect databases are limited in some way, so geographic extent, taxonomic scope, and many of these are led by relatively small groups of researchers with limited support for long-term database growth and management. So, why focus on traits? Why, have this goal of creating a global insect trait database? There are many reasons to create a global repository or database for insect traits, because by using traits instead of these traditional taxonomic approaches, we're able to identify patterns and commonalities of diversity across different spatial and temporal scales to help answer questions of insect decline. And so a trait-based approach can help simplify syntheses of diverse insect taxa. Traits can also provide insights into why species are responding differently to environmental change, which is a key question related to insect decline and abiotic environmental drivers. With this approach, we can link species morphology, behavior, physiology, those different trait categories to their ecological roles to understand how they're impacting ecosystems and why they might be changing and what that means for their populations. And then this framework also provides means for predicting changes in ecosystem function. So changes in insects, declines, increases, what does that mean for those functions that insects are providing to those systems? So global trait databases have been assembled for plants, as I've already mentioned, with the TRI database, but there's also been work on several vertebrate taxa. So there are databases for birds, for amphibians and lizards, and mammals. And these different global databases have really fueled trait-based research for these other groups. And so we really need something similar for insects to be able to answer the ecological questions that we're interested in. So coming back to our working group, we've got this lofty goal of creating this global unified database. But what have we done so far? Excuse me. We have so far looked to the literature and reviewed databases that currently exist, and we've summarized them. So of current insect databases, both terrestrial and freshwater. What's their current coverage of insect taxa and traits? There's actually many different types of traits out there that folks are using and measuring, and they vary based on the taxon. There's a variety of ways that folks are measuring traits, and there's also differences in taxonomic resolution within these databases. We've also, from this, identified some of those gaps that I just mentioned, some inconsistencies, limitations, and challenges that may be faced when trying to create this global trait database or repository. We've also considered and discussed best practices for how collating traits and how a database might be developed. So collating perhaps easier than harmonizing given the variation that we see across and within taxa. And so I want to dive in a little bit, highlighting some things that we've done and we've found so far and where we're going. And so we identified and summarized 37 different insect trait databases that exist. So we searched the literature online. We also put out requests to experts using the Ecolog listserv to try and identify these different databases, where they are and what's their status. And so where are insect trait data currently stored? In many places. So some databases are regional or global. They're often taxon specific, and they're often found in a repository. Sometimes you need a login to get that. Sometimes they're openly accessible. There's also a lot of trait data in the literature. So data sets that are supplementary to publications, and there's natural history documents. So one of the things that we ran into as a group is this distinction between a database versus a data set. And so these data are not, of course, housed in one location or in one repository. And so they're really disparate across the literature. And so most of these data exist in ways that perhaps will make it challenging to integrate and use them together to answer larger global or spatial questions. So we found these 37 trait databases, and then we went through them tediously and reviewed them for their coverage of insect taxa, the traits that they have. And I've got 3 different results that I'd like to share with you today. So some geographic limitations with the databases, taxonomic coverage and resolution differences across databases, and then, of course, the challenge of folks measuring many different types of traits and measuring them in many different ways. Okay, so first starting with geographic limitations. So one thing that we found was that trait coverage, so database coverage, is biased towards Europe and North America. And here you can see that in this map. And so we've got a number of databases, and these are color-coded, so darker purples and darker greens mean those locations have more trait databases. And so we see more databases here in North America and also in Europe. So we have a lack of trait data in Asia and Africa and parts of South America. And of course, we know that those are some of the most biodiverse places on Earth, and we're lacking the data from those areas. We also see that databases for these regions, so Europe and North America, there's more databases, and they also contain more trait data. And so that's what this map here on the bottom shows you. Here we've got number of traits color-coded, with dark purples and greens being more traits represented within those trait databases. So very similar pattern here with a bias of trait data in North America and in Europe. We did find that 1/3 of the trait databases have global coverage of trait data, but there often is a trade-off here where it's focused only on a single taxonomic group. And so LEP traits is a great example. It's a global database of butterfly traits, but only focused on Lepidoptera. The same is with the global ants database. There's a dragonfly and damselfly database and a termite database. Global coverage, but just one insect taxa. We also found some biases related to taxonomic coverage and resolution. And so we found that 50% of databases included traits for just a handful of insect orders. And so that's what this figure here is showing you. We've got insect orders along the y-axis here, and then we have database coverage as a percentage along the x. And then these numbers at the end of the bars, those represent the number of trait databases that include trait data for that insect order. And remember, our total here is 37. So 50% of the databases included traits for Coleoptera, Diptera, Lepidoptera, Hemiptera, and Odonata. We have a subset of smaller insect orders down here that are represented in very few insect trait databases. And then we have a collection of insect orders where we didn't find any trait data across any of these 37 databases. And so there are some biases here related to insect orders. And so thinking about collecting new trait data, these are gaps that we would want to fill in the future. We also found some really interesting patterns related to databases that focus on terrestrial insects versus freshwater insects. So first of all, most databases were either one or the other. We did find 16 that had trait data for both. And so within these databases that were either terrestrial or freshwater, there were some other differences. So for example, most terrestrial databases had trait data for adult insects and didn't include very much trait data for larval life stages, whereas the opposite was true for freshwater databases, where they often included trait data for larval life stages, which makes sense since many of those taxa are aquatic as immatures. We also found differences in how trait data were quantified, so like measurements of these traits. And so we often saw that terrestrial databases included a lot of continuous trait data, whereas freshwater databases included a lot of categorical data that had fuzzy coding and affinity scores. And so species, for example, were binned into like larger non-taxonomic groupings based on trait type, which can be beneficial for getting a measure of intraspecific or within species variation, but it also can hide raw measurements. So there are differences when we're looking at trait databases that primarily have terrestrial or freshwater insect data, which is an interesting finding. And then we also found that there was a lot of variation in taxonomic resolution, both within databases, but also across databases. And many databases did include species level data, but there was also a variety of other taxonomic levels. And so we actually found all of these listed here. So we have trait data for order, family, subfamily, tribe, genus, species, as well as morphospecies. So a lot of variability there in terms of taxonomic resolution. We also found a lot of variability in terms of trait type, how those traits were described, and how they were measured. And so generally traits fell into these broad categories that I have listed here: behavior, geography, habitat, life history, morphology, movement, phenology, physiology, reproduction, and trophic position. But how those traits were measured and categorized varied. And so sometimes they were continuous, categorical, discrete, or ordinal. And I have an example here. So perhaps a habitat trait in one database was included as a single trait, so habitat trait, with multiple trait values, so riffles, pools, runs, or rapids. But in a different trait database, it could be categorized as discrete traits. So where you have 3 different traits, riffles, pools, and runs, with a 1 indicating the category of that insect being within that habitat type. And so a variety of different ways that folks are even coding for very similar traits across these databases. We also found some interesting results related to the types of data and how folks were reporting these trait data. And so largely we saw species means, and there was very limited individual level data to look at interspecific trait variation. And so this, I guess, makes sense because a lot of research related to insect trait-based ecology is focused on interspecific trait variability, so among species. And there's been less focus, at least at this point, on intraspecific trait variability. So it's less commonly explored. And so there's less data represented in these databases for that. And in some ways, this makes sense. Capturing intraspecific variation requires measurement of many more individuals than just capturing a species mean. And depending upon the group that you're studying, this task can quickly become, a logistical challenge if you've got a really large community, or if you're looking at many different traits, or if you're working with like rare or endangered species to get enough individuals to capture that intraspecific variation. And then lastly, we found that morphological traits are the most common across all of these databases, particularly body size. And so if you remember from earlier, I highlighted body size as a proxy trait. So body size and many other morphological traits can be considered more proxy traits, but they're really easy to measure, which is why they're really common, right? You can measure them from natural history collections. They don't necessarily require like more complicated molecular work, and you can use simple tools to do these morphological measurements. So body size alone, although a lot of variability in how body size was measured, a measure of body size was represented in over 50% of the databases that we looked at. And so body size, for example, could be a key trait for like a synthesis opportunity because it is very common, but tackling these diversity approaches in terms of measuring is a challenge before doing that. And so we wanted to further explore some of these issues using body size as an example trait. And so I want to walk you through some of these variations that we observed in these databases using body size as an example. So our results found that body size really commonly measured insect trait. It's ecologically important, but it's easy to measure. And so it's not surprising that it's represented across a variety of different databases. But of course, when you're working with insects, you know that there's a population of insects out there that you're trying to sample, and that population can vary across space and time. And when you're doing research, you're collecting a subset or a sample of that population. And so there is some sampling bias that might be associated with the traits that are then measured. And so individuals from those populations that you collect may be biased particular times and places. And if you're calculating a species mean, those biases could be exacerbated. But nonetheless, you're working with a sample. But then there are also potential technical issues with insect preservation that can further bias those measurements. And so whether you pin that insect or you store it in ethanol, that could affect those body size measurements that you're collecting. So insects stored in ethanol are susceptible to swelling, while insects that are pinned may shrink as they dry out. And so these issues are of particular importance with initiatives that are looking at traits that have been previously collected, like insects that have been previously collected, going back to measure traits on those insects after they've been stored for quite some time. It is likely that those older specimens may have more altered sizes compared to newly collected specimens. And then there's a lot of variability in terms of measurement choices. So researchers have the choice of how they want to measure different components of the body, including body size, and there are multiple approaches to do this. And so this can be looking at the mass of an insect. It can be the total length for body size. Folks also measure body parts to be a proxy for body size, so like pronotum length or elytra length. And then there are also categorical binning approaches. And so different researchers that study different insect taxa may measure body size differently, but we also see this variability even within the same taxa. Okay. And then lastly, there are recording and aggregation choices that could lead to variation in database structure. And so databases can include raw measurements with individual specimen data, can be aggregated based on a species mean, There can be variation in taxonomic resolution. And there are also different ways of binning. And so approaches that can be split into binary categories or fuzzy coding approaches that can capture measurement variation. And so while, as I mentioned, most terrestrial databases did not report interspecific variation, many of those did include like numeric or continuous measurements, which would allow for more straightforward harmonization across databases compared to databases that use more categorical binning or fuzzy coding approaches. So just looking at one trait here, body size, a lot of different variation across the whole process that needs to be considered when trying to collate and harmonize trait data across different existing databases, taxonomic groups, etc. And so from this initial review of trait databases, we've identified some challenges ahead that would need to be addressed in order to create this global insect trait database. And so first, most insect species are trait data deficient. So this is primarily a result of their high diversity, their small size, and many insects just, we don't have trait data. We don't know their natural history. We don't know their distributions or temporal trends. So we just don't know many of this information for different insect groups. We also have poorly resolved taxonomy for many groups and undescribed taxa. And so many taxa, insect taxa, remain undescribed or they have poorly resolved taxonomy. And this combined with the lack of taxonomic expertise for groups can present a major challenge for the compilation of trait data. We also have old or non-synonymous taxonomic backbones across different databases that will need to be reconciled within the database for those data. And we also have non-complementary trait classification systems. So thinking about synthesizing data across current databases or data sets, we have various trait classification systems. So these variable binning categories, continuous data, etc., across databases. And then we have variable metadata availability as well. So this includes like the number of insects or traits sampled, measurements of methodology, trait representativeness and definitions, and etc., things like that. Okay. So some next steps for our group. So although, there's this really steep challenge that we've set out to do, create this global unified trait database for terrestrial and freshwater insects, this would be a really invaluable resource and really facilitate many questions relating to insect decline. So how and why insects are, their populations are changing in response to anthropogenic stressors and how those are impacting ecosystem function. And so we've already done this preliminary review of trait databases. And right now we are going back and expanding our search using a systematic review process to ensure that we have captured all insect trait databases that currently exist. And we are continuing to refine some of these preliminary results that I've presented here today. Okay. And then we're still thinking about developing standardized data entry protocols and integration standards and developing machine learning algorithms to aid trait data collection from the literature. And these two objectives are really being led by Pedro Cardoso and his team at the University of Lisbon. So Pedro and his team have already developed a world spider trait database. And so they are looking to use similar methodology to create a global repository of insect traits for GRIT. And so Pedro has the funding and the team that is looking and the expertise to develop some of these machine learning algorithms to start searching and scraping the literature and gathering existing trait data into a single location and make that available to researchers. And so given Pedro's focus on this aspect, our group is looking to really emphasize protocols for collecting new trait data. So collecting new trait data for data deficient taxa and from those undersampled regions, so Asia, Africa, parts of South America, and thinking about creating standardized protocols for new data collection so that they could be more easily integrated to assess these global questions of insect decline. There are significant funding challenges that exist related to these goals. And so identifying mechanisms of long-term funding so we can support these objectives is something that we've been doing continually, although we haven't had great success at this point. But this is really important. So most of those trait databases that we've surveyed so far, they did have trait data that were publicly accessible, but only a few of them had actually been updated with new trait data since they had been created. So this long-term funding is likely an issue for current databases, and it's going to be an issue if we look towards creating a global database and maintaining that over time. And then, of course, a really major goal and next step is to use these trait data that we collate and new trait data that we collect to understand insect decline and predict insect decline. Should be a top research priority for these trait database creation. Okay, and so lastly, I wanted to leave you with what we're going to be doing here in the coming months, and then also provide an avenue for folks that might want to get involved in these efforts. And so we just found out we had a workshop that was accepted for the Entomological Society of America meeting in November in Portland, standardizing the collection of insect trait data to identify ecological functions. And so this workshop has two goals. So first, identify variation in how insect ecologists are measuring functional traits. And this will likely come through a survey that the working group is going to develop in the coming months. And then secondarily, to identify core traits that are, of course, related to direct functions across insect taxa so that we can begin to build this standardized protocol for collecting new trait data. And following the workshop, these protocols that we discuss and develop at ESA will be used to write a white paper and will be distributed broadly to researchers. Folks can collaborate on this. And so these are the goals, and there are sort of two sections to the workshop that we're planning. So first, we want to bring together teams that are working on different aspects of insect trait databases so that they can come in and provide an update of where their team is at with these efforts, and we can really facilitate future collaboration. And so that includes the Glitters group, the Australian Insect Fire Response Traits group, and Pedro's group, GRIT, the Global Repository of Insect Traits. And so we'll have these teams provide updates on where they are. And then following that, we have identified taxonomic leaders that will lead breakout groups based on taxonomic order or interest and discuss key traits that those researchers focus on and how we can standardize data collection procedures. And so ideally, we would want to sit all these experts down and say, okay, if we want to measure body size, how do you all measure body size across your different insect orders? And how can we all do that in a systematic way so that that all relates to a similar function, for example? And we can ask and answer these broader questions related to insect decline. So look forward to that. They haven't identified like what day and time these workshops will be, but take a look at the program if you're attending ESA, and we'd love to have you there. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions. If there's any trait working group folks here, I encourage you to join in to this discussion. You can also reach us by email. And I've also included my GatherTown avatar, which is like a spitting image of me. So if you ever see me running around when we're using GatherTown for insect decline, feel free to stop and reach out. So thanks so much.